Assalamu alaikum and peace be with you all. This is Imam Malik Mujahid with Muslim Network TV. In Ramadan, normally we hear more about Palestinians standing up, calling for their freedom and democracy. This time, actually, Israelis are the one who are in the news, protesting against government trying to quote unquote reform judiciary, which they don't like. What is going on there? What does it mean for the liberation and equal rights for all human beings in that area? We have with us Richard Silverstein. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Richard.
Thanks for having me. I wanted to also wish your listeners a Ramadan Mabruk.
Thank
Um,
you.
and in terms of what's going on now in Israel, there is a massive uprising, pro-democracy uprising, mostly of Israeli Jews, less so of Israeli Palestinians, and we can talk more about that, the reason for that. The prime minister has proposed some anti-democracy legislation that is unprecedented in the history of Israel in terms of the level of repression of human rights that will be involved. And I have to say that all of the developments on the Palestinian side of things have been totally divorced from what's happening on the Jewish side of things. In other words, we have the pogroms that have happened in Huara. We have other actions by the Israeli military in the West Bank, which have killed many Palestinians there. And there's a kind of bifurcation in Israel between the Palestinians and between the Jews themselves. And it enables the Israeli Jews to live in a bubble where they only have to worry about their own economy and their own lives. And this is actually one of the major problems, I think, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I should say, in terms of going back to what's going on with the government, um, the prime minister has temporarily he's put on hold this legislative agenda that he's proposed, supposedly put on hold. It turns out actually that one of the main provisions of the laws that are being proposed actually was passed after he said he was going to pause everything. So Netanyahu is a very wily political tactician, and he's not to be trusted in anything that he promises, whether he's promising it to his own Israeli Jewish citizens or to the Palestinians.
Thank you so much. Richard Silverstein writes for Tikun Olam and has written for Middle East Tide, The Guardian, and the LA Times. What exactly are quote unquote this reform in judiciary, which seems to have inspired all of that?
Well, the Israeli Supreme Court has a reputation, sometimes it's not warranted, of protecting human rights for both Israeli Jewish and Palestinian citizens. The Israeli far right, which is the government in power right now, has always really hated the Supreme Court because it stood in the way of the farthest right, most extreme positions that the government, the Knesset, has supported. So they want to basically dismantle the Supreme Court, and the way that they're going to do it is by saying that the Supreme Court has no right to review laws and to overrule them if they violate the Constitution. And they also are going to change the way in which justices are approved and make it more political and almost solely at the discretion of the Knesset and the ruling coalition. So these are mostly judicial changes, but they really will enshrine the far right and give it even more power than it already does. And been in power basically since 1977. So we've had 50 years of far right domination of Israeli politics, and this will guarantee, decades more probably.
Richard, the pause or the delay of the passage of this reform, who will it benefit more, the government or the protesters?
Well, as I said, Netanyahu was a very shrewd tactician, so I think he hopes that delaying things by 4 weeks will take the air out of the the pro-democracy movement. I think that he's wrong about that. I think that what he did over the weekend, which was to respond to the defense minister who asked for this pause by firing him, it brought out tens of hundreds of thousands more people than even had been involved in the protests before. So the chances of him lessening tension or conflict and being able to fulfill his agenda are even less than they were before. And I think he's deluding himself if he thinks this pause is going to um, enable him to steamroll this agenda through the Knesset.
Richard, New York Times today has an article calling it, I quote, behind protest fury in Israel, fear of a quiet slide from democracy. Um, do you think that slide has been there for a while, or do you agree with those people who organizations like B'Tselem and Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, which call it an apartheid state?
Well, yes, of course, those are correct. Three major groups, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, have all called Israel an apartheid state from the river to the sea. I would go farther and say that Israel is not even a democracy. So basically, the protesters are calling for a to protect what little democracy there is in Israel. There is a democracy in a manner of speaking for Israeli Jews. Israeli Palestinians have never really enjoyed full democratic rights, even though they're citizens of the same state. And the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, of course, have enjoyed almost no rights. So we have to really be sort of careful and analyze things carefully. And the liberal, quote unquote, liberal media of the New York Times has always been afraid of using the term fascism, which I think is where we're headed, and so calling Israel a democratic state, which I don't believe it is. Um, there was another subject I think that's important here, and that's to talk about the U.S. role in all of this. There are two major think tanks and foundations in the United States, which are key players in creating this agenda. One is called the Tikva Fund. It's based in New York, and it was founded by a Wall Street oligarch named Roger Herzog. The chairman of the Tikva Fund is Elliot Abrams, who is a far right Republican Reagan era a functionary who was convicted of perjury in the Iran-Contra affair, and they are giving millions of dollars to an Israeli think tank called the Kohelet Fund. So American Jews are playing a huge role in fomenting this anti-democratic movement. And if they succeed in Israel, what they plan to do is export it back to the United States. So it's very important, I think, for Americans to understand that this is not just an incident that's happening abroad, overseas, somewhere outside of the United States, and that it's not going to have any blowback, because it will indeed have blowback. And one of the key elements of the targets of these plans are, of course, Muslim Americans, and in Israel, Palestinian Muslims, and the repression of religious rights in Haram al-Sharif is a key element of this. And another plan that they have is to outlaw the Palestinian political parties and say that any party that is considered anti-Zionist, in other words, not Jewish, will be eliminated from the Knesset and from politics. So I think all of these things are really critical for Americans to be aware of as well.
Richard, before we come in little more detail about America and Jewish and Muslim and Palestinians here, Civil society rising on such a critical issue, does it give you some hope that some people in civil society will go beyond asking to preserve whatever little democracy is there and call for a broader solution to the mother of a problem which Israel faces, which is the rights of Israeli Palestinian people?
Well, I would like to say that, and it would be my devout hope that this would happen. But I'm in touch with many Israelis on the left politically, and they are the ones who are waving Palestinian flags at these protests, but they're in the minority. And there are a lot of groups that are in the minority that are violently suppressed by the majority of demonstrators at these protests. There are Israelis I know who have been waving gay pride flags and who have waved Palestinian flags. And at most, these are tolerated as part of the demonstration. And at worst, they're attacked violently for having these sorts of views. So I think this is a long uphill battle by Israeli Jewish leftists and also by their Palestinian allies. I think that it's a battle, of course, worth fighting, but it's going to be a very, very long battle, I'm afraid to say.
Recently, a Gallup survey in the United States revealed that for the first time in their survey history, Americans are more sympathetic to Palestinians than they are to Israelis. Do you think that means that there is hope for US commitment to Israel vis-a-vis Palestine to change somewhat?
I think that the Biden administration has read that poll, and it has played a part in the role that it has played in the Netanyahu's reaction to the protests. In other words, I think that they're reading the tea leaves in Washington, and they understand that Americans are rapidly becoming more and more alienated from Israel, and that the support that Americans, Jews and Americans, by the way, American Jews are also lessening their commitment to Israel. So it's not just Americans in general, it's having the same impact on American Jews, which is interesting because you would think that American Jews would be the last group to lessen its support for Israel, but it's happening across the board. And I think that if you read that New York Times article I was referring to, Biden has had a huge impact in what is going on in Israel and the decision that Netanyahu made. The article says that the U.S. ambassador to Israel has been pressuring and lobbying. Biden himself has been speaking to Netanyahu and telling him that he's got to ease up. And I think that's because they understand that there's a rising movement within the Democratic Party of progressives who don't have the same kind of loyalty to Israel and don't have the same kind of feeling of fear of the Israel lobby, AIPAC and groups like that. So I do have much more hope on the American side of things that support for Israel is declining as Israel becomes more and more right wing and violent and fascist.
Well, thank you so much, Richard Silverstein, for your time. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me again. It's been great.
Well, stay tuned for other programming at Muslim Network TV. Peace, salam.